Welcome to the debate on cognitive dose. Our mission here, as always, is curing blind spots and shattering cognitive bias.
Exactly. And today we are doing a deep investigation into a pretty fascinating cognitive gap regarding macroeconomic policy.
Right, because between 2024 and 2026, researchers essentially handed 3,000 people $1,000 a month with absolutely no strings attached. And, according to the really loud critics, this experiment was just a macroeconomic disaster.
Because participants ended up working fewer hours.
Right, fewer raw hours. But the central question we're looking at today is, what if a drop in raw labor hours isn't actually a sign of laziness, but the exact economic mechanism we need to survive the impending artificial intelligence revolution?
It's a massive question.
It is. So, to explore this, we are looking at the deeply unorthodox socio-political evolution of Andrew Yang, focusing specifically on his early 2026 publication, Hey Yang, Where's My $1,000? And other true stories of staggering depth. I'll be arguing that his strategy of using, comedy and cultural commentary is a brilliant, necessary evolution to basically bypass a broken political system and get his ideas heard.
And I'll be taking the position that wrapping rigorous empirical economic data in a self-deprecating stand-up routine actively harms the policy. While the humor might be engaging, it masks severe structural realities.
You think it cheapens it?
I think it creates a dangerous cognitive gap between how these policies are perceived by the public and their proven macroeconomic utility.
Okay, well, let's lay the groundwork by looking at the book itself. Published early in 2026, it really doesn't look or read like a traditional policy manifesto at all.
Not in the slightest.
Right? It is explicitly packaged as this highly accessible comedy memoir. And it's aimed squarely at an electorate that is just, frankly, completely exhausted by hyper-partisan, toxic political narratives.
Yeah, the exhausted majority, as they say.
Exactly. The strategy here is essentially comedy as political diplomacy. By aligning himself with major stand-up comedians like Dave Chappelle, and intentionally engaging in long-form, casual dialogue rather than rigid talking points, he is trying to bypass the algorithmic outrage cycle.
He's slipping past the radar.
Right. He uses this disarming, self-deprecating tone to reintroduce his foundational policy proposals. Primarily the freedom dividend, a universal basic income of $1,000 a month to cushion the massive job displacement caused by artificial intelligence.
In the Forward Party as well.
Yes, the Forward Party as an infrastructural centrist alternative. It is a highly calculated attempt to use humor as a delivery mechanism for profound macroeconomic restructuring.
Well, that sounds great in theory, but let's look at the systemic reality. When you dive into our research dossier and look at the empirical data, the upbeat, self-deprecating framing of this book actually does a disservice to the movement.
Really? Even if it gets people listening?
Even then, we are dealing with policies that have hard empirical backing, yet they are being forced to wear the mask of a comedy routine just to survive in the public discourse. My concern is that by, laughing it off, we are failing to expose the massive gap between the public perception of these ideas, which are still frequently dismissed as utopian or fringe, and their actual rigorously proven effectiveness.
Okay, let's unpack that cognitive gap, starting with the systemic viability of the freedom dividend versus how it's politically framed. You're suggesting that the perception of UBI as a fringe theory is wildly disconnected from the data we currently possess.
It is completely disconnected. We are not operating in the realm of theory anymore. Over the last several years, the United States has seen the proliferation of over 120 guaranteed income pilots nationwide.
120?
Yeah, over 120. This isn't just thought experimentation. It is a massive, real-time, macroeconomic mobilization. Just look at the data compiled by Humanity Forward regarding the expanded federal child tax credit during the pandemic recovery.
Oh, right, because that expanded credit functioned essentially as a conditional proto-UBI.
Exactly. Now, the traditional conservative critique of unconditional cash transfers has always been that they uniformly depress labor participation.
Right. The idea that if you give people money, they will stop working and it breeds indolence.
Exactly. But the empirical reality completely shattered that assumption.
I mean, the Census Bureau's household pulse survey data is incredibly illuminating there.
It really is. Analyzing that data, researchers found that 94% of parents plan to maintain or even increase their paid work hours despite receiving the monthly credit.
Wow, 94%.
Yes. Only about 6% expressed an intent to work less. And that demographic was overwhelmingly parents of infants who were prioritizing early childhood care over low-wage labor, which quite frankly is a massive net positive for long-term societal health.
Definitely.
Furthermore, macroeconomic models demonstrated that this cash injection generated $18.6 billion in local economic activity against a cost of $14.9 billion. That is a massive 25% return on investment.
I think we need to explain how that return on investment actually happens on the ground. Because $18.6 billion doesn't just, appear out of thin air. It's about the velocity of money, right?
Precisely. The velocity of money is key here. When you give a massive tax break to a billionaire, that capital often gets parked in offshore accounts or it's tied up in stock buybacks. The velocity of that money is incredibly slow.
It just sits there.
Exactly. But when you give $1,000 to a working-class family living paycheck to paycheck, they spend it by Friday.
Right.
They fix the alternator on their car, they buy groceries, they pay for their kids' shoes. That money instantly flows to the local mechanic, the local grocer, the local shoe store. It spurs entrepreneurship, protects families from predatory payday lending, and basically revitalizes local Main Street economies. It is a highly effective macroeconomic tool.
Okay, but if we look closely at the underlying assumption here, doesn't this comedic strategy actually widen the cognitive gap you're talking about?
How do you mean?
Well, by wrapping a rigorous, data-proven macroeconomic restructuring in a self-deprecating joke. I mean, calling the book, "Hey Young, Where's My $1,000?" Doesn't this packaging actively harm the policy? Let me finish this thought, because it seems to me that hiding this level of systemic economic data behind a comedy routine gives the political establishment permission to just not take the data seriously. You are presenting $18.6 billion in economic generation, and it's being sold with a punchline.
See, I come at it from a different way. You have to understand the environment these ideas are trying to penetrate. We exist in a media ecosystem that is utterly immune to earnest, data-driven policy white papers.
That's sadly true.
Right? If you simply present the multiplier effects of a value-added tax or the Gini coefficient alterations, the partisan algorithms instantly suppress it, or they weaponize it. The comedic packaging isn't a dismissal of the data, it is an active calculated camouflage.
Camouflage?
Yes. It is restorative dialogue. By leaning into the humor, you disarm the exhausted majority who have completely tuned out of the toxic political warfare. You actually get them to listen.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. When you use comedy to bypass the establishment, you risk failing to educate the electorate on the actual mechanics of the policy.
Well,
Because funding a $2.8 trillion annual expenditure requires a massive expansion of the federal budget. If the electorate only digests the comedy and the free money concept, they remain entirely unequipped to defend the policy against serious academic scrutiny.
like what?
For instance, the threat of demand pull inflation. If you don't explain the mechanics, voters are left vulnerable to the classic counter-argument. If everyone suddenly has an extra $1,000 a month, won't landlords just raise rents by $1,000 because housing is essential and the supply is limited? You have to explain how the policy is funded to counter that.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the distributional analysis of the funding mechanism itself? The UBI is typically paired with a value-added tax, or VAT, which taxes consumption. Critics immediately argue that a VAT in isolation is regressive because lower-income individuals spend a higher percentage of their income on basic goods.
Which is an entirely valid concern.
It is, until you look at the entire equation. Static modeling by the UBI Center proves that when you combine the regressive VAT with the flat $1,000 universal payment, the net aggregate effect is highly progressive.
So the math flips.
Yes. Let's look at the math. A wealthy individual consuming $200,000 worth of luxury goods pays far more into the VAT than the $12,000 they receive annually in UBI. They are a net payer into the system.
Okay. Making sense.
But a person earning $30,000 a year might pay $3,000 extra in consumption taxes over the year, but they receive $12,000 in cash. Their net disposable income actually increases by $9,000.
Wow.
Right? 90% of households earning under $50,000 annually come out mathematically ahead. The humor might get them in the door, but the mathematical reality of their improved disposable income is what builds a durable political coalition.
Which brings us to the most contentious piece of empirical data regarding human behavior and labor elasticity. We absolutely have to address the 2024 to 2026 Open Research Basic Income Trials funded by Sam Altman, SAM. Altman.
We do, because this is the definitive, exhaustively scaled study on the subject. It was a randomized controlled trial of 3,000 low-income adults across Illinois and Texas. The treatment group received an unconditional $1,000 per month for 3 years.
And the top-line findings immediately became a political flashpoint.
Exactly. Raw weekly labor hours reduced by 1.3 to 1.4 hours per participant. Total individual income, excluding the transfer, fell by about $1,500 a year. Opponents immediately weaponized this to declare the trial a catastrophic failure, arguing it damages aggregate productivity.
Right. But the provided research points out a massive blind spot in how we measure economic health. To offer an analogy here, fetishizing raw aggregate labor hours is like measuring a runner's success by how long they stay on a treadmill, instead of whether they actually reached a destination.
Precisely. It's a completely flawed metric.
We're measuring success by exhaustion. If a single mother drops her hours from 45 down to 43 so she can actually see her children before they go to sleep, the traditional economic model flags that as a loss of productivity. But from a societal health perspective, that is a monumental victory.
And this is exactly where the qualitative data from Open Research Director Elizabeth Rhodes is vital. It completely reframes that 1.3-hour drop. We need to introduce the concept of liquidity as leverage.
Liquidity as leverage, okay.
When a worker is living paycheck to paycheck, they can't afford a 3-week gap in income. That means they can't quit an exploitative job to spend time interviewing for a better one. The employer holds all the power.
Right.
But when you introduce an unconditional $1,000 a month, it acts as a personal strike fund. The data showed recipients were 5.5 percentage points more likely to explicitly demand interesting or meaningful work as an essential condition for employment.
So they bought themselves the financial autonomy to say no?
Exactly. They aren't dropping out of the workforce to sit on the couch. They are buying themselves the time to negotiate better terms. And the most striking statistic, female recipients were 15% more likely to start a business by the 3rd year.
That's huge.
It is a fundamental shift in risk assessment. You cannot start a business if missing a week of wages means you get evicted. Liquidity changes the entire psychology of the labor market.
And this forces the discussion toward the terminal miscalculation of our current state economic objectives, especially in the face of the artificial intelligence threat. The AI math problem is no longer horizon-level futurology.
No, it's happening right now.
It is a present reality causing massive displacement in white-collar and administrative sectors. If AI is rapidly automating rote tasks, writing code, generating legal briefs, analyzing medical scans, prioritizing raw aggregate hours is an antiquated industrial-era objective.
Absolutely.
The state must fundamentally pivot. We must stop optimizing for brute hours worked and start optimizing for labor market matching, fostering entrepreneurship, and efficiently capturing the massive productivity dividends generated by machine intelligence.
Well, I'm sorry, but I have to push back on the framing that this is merely a pivot in objectives. It is much deeper than that. It is a fundamental crisis of state capacity.
A crisis of capacity?
Yes. Policy analysts studying the post-labor economy point out that if mass technological unemployment fully materializes, traditional tax revenues based on labor and consumption will simply collapse. In a true artificial general intelligence economy, a UBI funded by a VAT isn't enough. AI doesn't pay income tax.
Wow. Right.
To maintain society, the state would require unprecedented taxation directly on capital, on computational power, and on machine labor itself. The 1.4-hour drop in human labor is exactly what should happen. When AI supplements lost productivity, it creates human leisure in family bonding without a drop in gross domestic product. But our current legislative system is entirely incapable of making this transition.
But even if we accept that AI fundamentally changes the labor math, you're entirely ignoring the political reality here. No legislative body in America is equipped to tax capital at that scale. The two-party system structurally blocks it.
Which is exactly why the analysis of the Forward Party in Yang's book is so critical. The Forward Party is frequently misunderstood by the media as an idealistic, kind of split-the-difference centrist political movement. It is not.
No?
No. It is an infrastructural workaround. The two-party duopoly inherently blocks highly popular pragmatic economic policies precisely because those policies lack dedicated institutional backing from the DNC or the GOP. The duopoly is designed to reward ideological extremism and punish moderate consensus, because partisan warfare is highly profitable for fundraising and media engagement.
I hear that critique, and I agree the system is broken, but let's interrogate the proposed solution. The Forward Party's operational objectives are securing 50 state ballot access and implementing mechanical reforms like ranked choice voting and nonpartisan open primaries.
Yes.
But focusing on ranked choice voting while the AI economy threatens to displace tens of millions of workers, it feels like trying to upgrade the steering wheel on a car while the engine is currently on fire. It seems like procedural wishful thinking in the face of an immediate catastrophe.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that analogy. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
The legislative system is the engine, and right now it is mathematically programmed to fail. Ranked choice voting is not procedural wishful thinking. It is an absolute mechanical necessity for the survival of the republic. You cannot pass substantive economic reform through a broken legislative vessel. We have to look at how plurality voting creates the spoiler effect.
Walk us through the mechanics of that.
Okay, under our current system, let's say you have a pragmatic centrist candidate, a far-right candidate, and a far-left candidate. The majority of the electorate might actually prefer the centrist, but they are terrified of inadvertently electing their least preferred candidate.
Right, so they vote defensively.
Exactly. They abandon the centrist and vote for the lesser of two evils within the duopoly. Because of closed partisan primaries, candidates only have to pander to the most radical fringes of their base to secure a nomination. Ranked choice voting completely eliminates the spoiler effect.
Because you have backups.
Right. You rank the centrist first and your fallback candidate second. If your first choice doesn't win, your vote instantly transfers to your second choice. It mathematically forces elected officials to be accountable to the general moderate electorate because they have to campaign for second choice votes. They literally cannot afford to alienate the middle.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The mechanics of ranked choice voting are mathematically sound, yes. But establishing sustained third-party viability in the United States faces immense, almost insurmountable financial and institutional barriers erected by the major parties.
True.
They have billions of dollars and deeply entrenched legal frameworks designed to crush third parties before they even reach the ballot. The Forward Party is attempting to build a coalition of the exhausted majority, relying on data-driven problem-solving. But as we discussed earlier, the electorate is largely insulated from facts on the ground, living in algorithmic partisan spin bubbles.
Which brings us full circle to why the comedic cultural diplomacy of Yang, "Where's my $1,000" is deployed in the first place. You cannot break a partisan spin bubble with a white paper on the mathematical benefits of ranked choice voting.
People's eyes just glaze over.
Completely. You break the bubble by being authentic, by being self-deprecating, and by engaging culturally rather than strictly politically. The empirical data on UBI's effectiveness is suppressed by the duopoly. The necessity of electoral reform is ignored by the duopoly. The only way to deliver the structural engineering required to survive the AI transition is to bypass the traditional political gatekeeping entirely and speak directly to the culture.
Wow. Let's synthesize our findings here, because we have uncovered a deeply complex and, frankly, slightly tragic dynamic today. We started by examining a 2026 political memoir wrapped in humor and self-deprecation. But beneath that accessible surface, we found a rigorous, empirically backed struggle to implement a universal basic income.
Yeah.
And the data clearly shows that providing liquidity to the working class does not destroy labor. It transforms it. It acts as a strike fund that allows citizens to demand meaningful work,
and fosters a massive increase in entrepreneurship.
And we found that the implementation of that exact economic lifeline, which we desperately need as AI automates rote tasks, is entirely roadblocked by an electoral duopoly that structurally rejects pragmatic consensus. Therefore, mechanical reforms like ranked choice voting aren't just idealistic secondary goals, they are the required prerequisites.
Right.
You cannot fix the economy until you fix the mechanics of how we elect the people in charge of the economy.
It leads to a profoundly sobering realization. We live in a society where empirically proven macroeconomic tools and vital democratic survival mechanisms literally have to be disguised within a self-deprecating comedy routine just to bypass the algorithmic outrage cycle.
It's a staggering indictment of our institutional capacity. I mean, think about the child tax credit data we discussed.
Yeah.
The fact that a data-proven policy that generated a 25% return on investment and stabilized millions of families during a crisis is still viewed by the establishment as a utopian fringe theory. It just shows how deeply our cognitive landscape has been manipulated by the two-party system.
And that is the final thought-provoking observation we must leave our listeners with today. The tragedy of our current era isn't that the solutions to technological displacement and economic stratification don't exist. They do. We have the pilot programs. We have the economic models. We have the math.
We absolutely do.
The true tragedy is that our current political incentives are entirely immune to the data that proves those solutions work.
And until we change the structural mechanics of how leaders are elected and held accountable, all the empirical data in the world will continue to be discarded.
It's a sobering thought. Will the mathematical realities of AI displacement break the political duopoly, or will the duopoly break the economy first?
We encourage everyone to use this rigorous analytical approach to build your own mental immunity. Thank you for joining us on The Debate on Cognitive Dose.